Okay, all right. I guess we'll get started. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So you all got the email yesterday reminding you about this workshop and letting you know that our terms of engagement for today, or the topics that we're going to focus on, are global/diasporic and interdisciplinary. And the email contained this question of how does the global and the interdisciplinary show up in your classroom. So Asia and I are going to facilitate this, and the first part I'll do, and she'll do the second part. I'm just going to say a few opening words and present some general questions, and then we'll break into small groups, so that's what you can expect. But the reason for focusing on these is that obviously the ADW syllabus says, this is exactly what it says ADW 111 examines the major themes associated with the African diaspora within a global context and from an interdisciplinary and gender-informed perspectives. And the syllabus has a lot on it, right? So we know that there are a lot of readings and films and concepts that our students are completely unfamiliar with. So it's worth pausing and thinking, in the effort of covering all of that material, does the global and the interdisciplinary sometimes get overlooked? Like, do you ever find yourself sort of retreating into maybe a narrower, more familiar and comfortable disciplinary silo, or a particular geographic location that's more familiar to you, and in the process, that intent that we be global and interdisciplinary is lost for you and for your students? So that's sort of the starting point for why we're going to climb into these two words that seem really obvious, but really climb into them, walk around, think about them in really specific ways. And for that reason, I'm going to pass around copies of the schedule of readings and assignments so that we can be really specific as we talk about these terms, where they actually, I mean, we know that overall the syllabus is supposed to do this, be global and interdisciplinary, but we want you to find the spaces, the moments that you specifically are doing this in your classroom and you feel you're doing it well, so you have an opportunity to share that with each other. Or moments where you find it particularly challenging and you do retreat into your own disciplinary training in a way that maybe leaves your students getting only a partial picture of something. So for that reason, yeah, we're killing trees and having loudspeakers. Both semesters, the whole year is fair game, fall and spring semester for this conversation. Okay. And also, as ambitious as the syllabus is, we also have to admit that not all disciplines are represented and not all geographic areas are represented. And if yours is not, it's probably even more obvious to you. So today's conversation isn't about what's missing, it's not about changing the syllabus. That's something maybe we can tackle another day, and I think we're supposed to for a retreat in May. Today is to work with what's actually here and what we actually are holding the students responsible for, and maximizing that through the interdisciplinary and global. So the overarching questions for both Asia and I are, what do global and interdisciplinary really mean? How do we actively transcend geographic and disciplinary boundaries in our ADW classroom, and why does it matter? And part of why it matters is ADW isn't just a course in and of itself, it's representative of a larger field of study, right? This is reflective of African diaspora studies, a field of studies in the academy which is global and interdisciplinary. So it's not just about ADW, even though that's going to be our reference point for today. And just to provide one, obviously there are many definitions or descriptions of African diaspora studies, and I'm just going to provide one. African diaspora studies, in its most robust and enabling conception, covers the African world comprehensively conceived, Africa and its diaspora populations, wherever we find them, from all disciplinary perspectives. And that comes from this book, The African Diaspora and the Disciplines. So now I'll move into, this is basically the same questions you just saw 2 slides ago, but I've taken out the global because Asia's going to focus on that. So now just thinking about what does interdisciplinary mean, how do we transcend the disciplines, and why does it matter? And the additional question of, is interdisciplinary understood or experienced differently for the ADW instructor versus the student? So you might consider if it's implicit, is it explicit? Do you really pause to talk about disciplines in some kind of way that your students would leave understanding where the texts are coming from and the methods behind the text that you're reading, and talking about where these concepts emerge from? Do you make it explicit, or do you just kind of leave it to the syllabus to convey that it's global and interdisciplinary? So by way of, I don't know, setting the stage, I'd like to actually hear at least some brief comments now, and after we get through these first few general questions, we can break into smaller groups and have more detailed conversation. But I wanted to hear, first of all, what you understand a discipline to be. These days, probably disciplines are more permeable than ever. We hear about interdisciplinarity all the time. It's a buzzword in the academy, and it sounds really positive for any scholar to say that they can converse across disciplines. However, if you can converse across disciplines, that means that there are actually disciplines. So does anyone want to offer up what you understand a discipline to be? Just before I put up some basic definition. Do you even, I mean, maybe some people have stopped thinking in terms of discipline. Maybe you really identify as an interdisciplinary scholar. But regardless, what is a discipline?
I was thinking of it as an area of study.
An area of study, okay. Yeah.
I would just add, I would say thorough studies of the research and the artistic production within the discipline of theater, of a particular study or a particular area of body of knowledge.
Okay. Anyone else want to add to that?
Methodology of study, for instance, approaching the film from an anthropological point of view or a film studies point of view.
All right. Yep. Agreed. Anyone else want to add?
I think disciplines are also entangled in the Colonial Project.
Yep.
In interesting ways.
Yeah.
Definitely an academic exercise more than in lived experiences, the divisions.
Which is, yeah, definitely academic, colonial, not necessarily helpful for understanding the real world, real experiences, which is why, you know, we go to interdisciplinarity much more now than previous generations did. So, inside the academy, the term discipline refers to a particular branch of learning or body of knowledge, such as physics, psychology, or history. Disciplines are distinguished from one another by several factors, and these include the questions they ask about the world, their perspective or worldview, the set of assumptions they employ, the methods they use to build up a body of knowledge, the facts, concepts, theories around a certain subject matter. So we understand what discipline is, and we're trying to ensure that when students leave ADW, that they have had an interdisciplinary experience in terms of all of these. That say, for example, they don't finish a year of ADW thinking that this was an African American history course. It could happen. I mean, depending on what your focus is, and whether you're global or not, and how much you bring things in or connect to the present moment. Students could be thinking it's an African American history class, but it's not. All right, So having established that, what does interdisciplinary mean? What does it entail? I said a minute ago that it's a buzzword in the academy. It seems desirable, people throw it around all the time, but what does it really mean? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How would you describe it?
I would think of it as not only tossing disciplines, but also synthesizing the knowledge that you gain from these different disciplines in order to come up with a different perspective or knowledge.
Yeah, synthesize, that's an important one, yeah. What else? I mean, you might compare it to, in addition to figuring out what interdisciplinary is by comparing it to what we just said about discipline, you could also compare it to multidisciplinary, which isn't the same thing. It doesn't entail synthesis, right? You can have a course that's multidisciplinary, and one week you're talking about English, the next week about history, next week about psychology, but that is not what we're supposed to be doing here in ADW. So how else might you describe interdisciplinary? Even if it's just a word, another word.
Well, how they intersect.
Intersections.
And influence each other.
Intersections, mutually influencing. Sure. Anything else?
Better informed.
Well-rounded, better informed. Reminds me of holistic, right? Getting a holistic perspective of something. Anything else? Okay. So I would offer this. Interdisciplinary instruction entails the use and integration of methods and analytical frameworks from more than one academic discipline to explain a theme, issue, question, or topic. Interdisciplinary education makes use of disciplinary approaches to examine topics, but pushes beyond by taking insights from a variety of relevant disciplines, synthesizing their contribution to understanding, and then integrating these ideas into a more complete and hopefully coherent framework of analysis. So, another way of expressing what those few of you who just spoke up were saying, just other words to express that. So the next question is, now that we have a basic agreement, and we're going to talk about this more in small groups, but now that we have a basic agreement about what it is, the next question is, why does it matter? So what? Why is an interdisciplinary perspective necessary? Why does it matter? Can we at least begin the conversation? Why does ADW need to be interdisciplinary? What are the benefits? What would be lost if it wasn't interdisciplinary? Can you offer up some words on that?
Well, I think we can only think about social problems at the intersection of disciplines. So when we're talking about Black people, the challenges we face nationally and globally, I think that to present a holistic account of the challenges requires us to pull from different bodies of knowledge. So there's something about interdisciplinary which lends itself to seeing some things that will be obscured if you only ask a certain kind of a question.
Yeah. So it would be interesting when you're in your small groups and you're looking at the reading and assignment schedule, if you can find moments where that's really clear, it rises to the surface that, wow, you have these different kinds of sources and disciplines in conversation with each other, and you're really getting this holistic view of a problem. And it's really obvious to you, and it's really obvious to your students, and maybe you can surface it and highlight it. Why else? Does anyone else want to suggest why it's important?
Understanding that our students are coming from different disciplines, looking at it in different ways draws them into the process, and hopefully they will analyze and synthesize based on their own disciplines.
So this is
find relevance.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'd like to think that regardless of our students' majors, that we can help them see that there's a connection to ADW, and we can use them as resources. I mean, they are first-year students and they have a major, but maybe they're not that far into it and they don't necessarily have all the methods and the vocabulary from their discipline, but they have something, right? Or they wouldn't have gotten into that discipline. And so we can take advantage of that and put them in conversations with each other to help surface these different perspectives. Yeah.
Well, I think we also have to take into consideration that the students here are coming from different regions of the country, okay, and their experiences, which I have in my class, are totally different. I mean, it's 6 different regions, so that is something very necessary for them based on their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think of, when we're talking about global, when we talk about bringing in different geographical spaces, I mean, the fact that there's complexity and diversity right within a single nation, which they can appreciate amongst themselves right in the space of a classroom, even if you don't have international students, that's certainly something to take advantage of to get them to understand why it's important to also look outside the United States. Because if we're so diverse in the country, imagine how diverse we are if we look outside. Yeah.
Also to deconstruct the kind of knowledge that is created within those disciplines, because as we talked about it and Asian pointed out that it is colonized language that we use and methodologies oftentimes within the discipline. Or even contestations within the discipline are moving towards making those methodologies more interdisciplinary.
Yeah, like a recognition also of biases, like the word bias comes up. Other thoughts?
I think they begin to start conceptualizing from a broader global perspective and starting to apply that across different circumstances, and then they can see that it's not just their discipline, it's not just the one thing they're learning, it shows up in every field. And
Yeah.
that conceptualization, they can start to problematize and ask the problem posing questions as we start off with generally. And then it doesn't become as, like, I don't know what this is. Like, I don't know what this is, I don't know, this is not even my field, I don't,
Right, I mean, that makes me think of, we have a lot of STEM students and,
Yeah.
surfacing this idea of
Right.
discipline and interdisciplinary and what that means and what it entails in terms of bodies of knowledge and methods and theories comes to mind because I often hear students say, this course is just a lot of reading and writing and I don't do that. I'm a bio major.
right.
So, making them realize this isn't just about a lot of reading and writing. I mean, there's something else behind it, which, is why it's helpful to think about these terms of disciplinary. All right, so I'll offer up this. Today, interdisciplinary learning at all levels is far more common as there is a growing recognition that is needed to answer complex questions, solve complex problems, and gain coherent understanding of complex issues that are increasingly beyond the ability of any single discipline.
Can I add too that I think interdisciplinarity lends itself to collaboration. So we don't have to cover every discipline ourselves,
Right.
but that it creates a bridge to collaborate between scholars and also students. I mean, if we pose it like that, right? It's like, think about the things that you can create and the problems you can solve if you're able to join up with your colleagues from different parts of campus. So I think interdisciplinarity kind of sparks that conversation around collaboration and creation.
Yeah, something to create something different. It's a creative space. So for our purposes today, when you're in the small groups and you're addressing some specific questions about where it shows up in your classroom, the idea is that hopefully, because we all have different disciplinary training, but we're all trying to be interdisciplinary in ADW, that we can brainstorm together some ideas and share some ideas that maybe didn't occur to us because we are not as familiar with some disciplines as we are with others. So this is going to be a space for that.
I just wanted to also add the fact that this is absolutely necessary for ADW, especially because we are talking about how geographical locations and shifting those locations means shifting worldviews and how do you bring all of that for knowledge, for the production of knowledge, new knowledge, so that we can actually deconstruct what is given as the knowledge.
Right. So in terms of still, why is it necessary? Why does it matter? If we just, put it in relation to the African diaspora, I'll offer up this, also from same book. The African diaspora is mutually constitutive of other political formations such as race, class, gender, sexuality, and environment, and must therefore be studied from an overlapping comparative perspective. Though adhering to different local configurations, all of these political formations traverse the boundaries of disciplines and therefore demand global interdisciplinary analysis. So, this is a point at which, we didn't do introductions, I didn't introduce myself. Some of us haven't seen each other in a year and a half because we have the treatment group and the control group here in this space. But in a minute, when you break into small groups, you'll have an opportunity to introduce yourself and say what your discipline is. Plus, I didn't do it because half of you were not here tonight. So we start a little bit slower. But right now, you're going to get into groups of 3 and 4 or 3 or 4 people with some specific questions I'll put up here. But before doing that, I just wanted to read a couple questions, again from this book, The African Diaspora and the Disciplines. Because when you introduce yourself in your small group, in addition to your name, you're going to say what your disciplinary identity is. And while our task today is thinking about teaching in an interdisciplinary way, obviously your training and your identity as a scholar may be impacting your relationship to ADW, the content, the way that you approach teaching it, how you feel about interdisciplinarity, how you feel about the global that we're also going to talk about. So we have to acknowledge that up front. So I'm going to read just a couple questions that we can't necessarily address today, but you might have them in the back of your mind and recognize that they might be influencing you in the classroom. So a couple of them are, is the African diaspora seen as a discrete field within your discipline? If so, how is it distinguished from other fields like African American studies, migration studies, etc.? In short, how does your discipline define the African diaspora? What are the major methodological conventions of your discipline, particularly as they relate to the African diaspora? Has the practice of African diaspora studies impacted your discipline in any way? What are the constraints and possibilities of doing African diaspora in your discipline? So, if you want to revisit those questions, those have the book up here. But what you're going to think about right now is the following. So, name, disciplinary identity, how your scholarship as an individual or your creative production intersects with African diaspora studies, or if you don't think that it does, how your discipline intersects with African diaspora studies. So if you don't feel like you as an individual, your individual work intersects in a really clear way, you might consider the questions that I just read about the larger discipline that you consider yourself a part of. And then moving on from there, how do you operationalize interdisciplinary in your ADW classroom? What does it look like in your classroom? How does it show up? So this is where you're going to pull out the handout of the actual assignment and reading schedule for both semesters and discuss in relation to specific days, weeks, texts, topics, concepts, writers. Think about your lectures, your discussions, the assignments we actually have on the syllabus, or maybe you have small assignments that are not on the syllabus. Anybody to give an extra assignment. There's already a lot of work in ADW, but maybe you have little activities or exercises that you do that you can point to and share with us. And each group is asked to compile just a brief bullet list. If you came up with something you bring into a lecture or a clever activity to talk about a certain reading or a certain concept that really is a demonstration, a performance of interdisciplinarity, please put that in your bullet point list and make it legible. I'm going to collect these from all the groups and basically compile a single document after today. Just type it up and make it available to all of us. Because remember, this is a brainstorming of really concrete practices that you have in your classroom. And then, let's see, you can also discuss where and when do you find it most challenging to employ interdisciplinary perspective. So I said a couple of times a few minutes ago, are there moments in the ADW course where you retreat into one single discipline and your individual training because it feels more comfortable and more familiar and you don't have a larger vocabulary to draw on, And so your students might be getting just a history perspective on something, or a lit perspective, or something that's just narrower than interdisciplinary. Are there moments when it gets lost and it's challenging? And then we'll reconvene as a large group and share some of the highlights of what you talked about in small groups, some of the best bullet points you came up with for activities, assignments, examples to bring into lectures. So that's our task. I don't know how long this is going to take us, depending on how chatty you are. But we've got time. So can you get into groups of, I don't know how many people we are now, but like 3 people, and try not to have any 2 people who have the same disciplinary identity? I mean, again, maybe we all think we're interdisciplinary, but you got your degree in something. So try to make sure that no 2 people have the same degree in your group. And commence doing this. Okay, how about that's fine. I'm really curious.
We have different
Great, I'm so glad you're doing this.
because I'm an interdisciplinary.
Right, exactly, practical. Walk away with a
Just like the students. Oh, I got too many.
And I have another engagement tomorrow. But I want what I want. And I think that
Let's see if you can.
you know, and it sounds good when you let it go. And this, you know, I don't think I would be able to.
maybe we should have
Maybe a little more. I'm training. You do.
But I don't know if I like
I'm sure you can add to the conversation.
That's what you're going to talk about. So, but I'm multiple. So,
Here we go.
I'm just saying. I'm trained
Yeah, that's it. So
psychologist.
reconvene and talk about it.
I'm an average dad, side of that, right? So it's like average dad, so all those things, gender, birth, and sociology. And then I do have training leadership. I have not. You have to talk to me. This is true. That's like a hard work. That so we decided that, you know, my whole brain from the time I was 7 has been different. So I read a lot and then I stopped reading. Then I stopped reading a lot because I had all other stuff. Like I feel like a Harry novel like I used to.
Why did the English thing go from
That's it.
I mean, I really don't think any of us do pretty much.
I want to say, I want to hear you now. But,
I mean, I'm saying beyond that. And that too, I have that. That actually was one of my childhood. Really? That's like the core.
You'll be fine. You can ask me, I won't be.
I found that, I believe that ultimately, ladies are gonna have to learn how to have interpersonal conversations as I get a lot of resistance, covert resistance. You have a lot of it. You have an idea. You have an idea, and that's what well, this deal.
And that transition.
And all that
concept
Why he wrote
in one language.
But before that,
Because
what
it's
they
a
collective
holistic
identity.
approach
Before they could get to the I, because there's no I. Yeah, the I just says the yeah, or I want to.
I had a student yesterday, she didn't go to something about why do I have to
Was
write
that
so
developed?
much? My discipline said, I said, wait a minute.
It's supported by every discipline, but that you do, that what's important is progress. Because progress is defined in the quality of not the whole world, but the whole world, one.
Let's take off the blinders and let's not be you're a part of
that in order for them to progress, they have to adopt this in some way. Science is part of the family. So, so in terms of the district, my whole critique is for me to say,
Right, it's a long conversation, that's why I said that's all. Sometimes it
But I think that's why
in the United States,
how the knowledge constructed from that perspective. I was more human.
ignoring your history, so that's the, you have nothing to teach the world. You're just now wild happening.
an introduction to
Latin America,
a whole lot of
plantation. You just have natural monkeys that come from. So this plantation and it's the basket of science, objectivity.
Right, right, the Negro. And that's what I bring up, yeah, because that's what I go into, in terms of the use of
And maybe we ought to work toward that. Let's focus on those two things.
Yeah, I love that question. And by then, I think having have that relationship with them, you know, it's just, you know, they know the expectations.
Satisfy
Bring them out. That's how we, you know, that's the thing. All stuff is immersive out there. It keeps coming out.
All right, everyone, can we reconvene? Are we ready? All right, can we get back into like a large circle so we can all see each other? All right, so I got to visit every group. It was great. I hope this was useful. I was going to ask you to all go around and introduce yourself by name and discipline, but we're going to stall because Asia stepped out and she and I both wanted to know exactly what disciplines were in the classroom, so she wouldn't want to miss that. So we're not going to, no introductions quite yet. So we'll start instead hearing some of what you came up with, but I'm going to give you one example first. Even though I just told everyone to look at the actual course readings and what's actually assigned, my example is not on the syllabus, so don't do it on the bus. However, this is something that some of you who've taught this for a couple of years have seen. So
Don't say.
I'm going to put it up here. No, say something. Help me put it in context. But I'm going to put up, I don't even know if you're going to be able to see the image here. But so it's not on the syllabus, but it's something that people used in the first 1 or 2 classes one semester because it was in the news. And there are ways in which you can use this for other subject matter. So I think it's something that you can just insert different topic or something. So it's this. Yeah. So this was when Ferguson, the Mike Brown, was in the news, and somebody circulated some version of this document, and I tweaked it for my section. And some of us used it in week 2 of the fall semester when we were talking about construction of knowledge, revolution of pedagogy, critical consciousness, and it was asking the students to think about what was going on in Ferguson and to really be explicit about different disciplinary approaches to it. So what this handout has, it's like, for example, what does it say? In an effort to actively engage in interdisciplinarity, answer one of the questions below based on your academic or scholarly interest, and be prepared to put your answer in conversation with the answers of students holding other interests. So not just being isolated, multidisciplinary, but be prepared to have a really integrated conversation between each other. Consider what your answer contributes to our understanding of the situation in Ferguson and to see it for what it is. So, for example, chemistry, what are the chemical properties of tear gas? How do these properties impact vision, the brain, and the lungs? Physiology, what impact does tear gas have on the asthmatics and pregnant women? Biology, according to preliminary autopsy reports, to which parts of the body did Michael Brown receive gunshots? What does this autopsy reveal about Brown's death based on trauma on his body? Let's see. Psychology, political science, what are the social problems at the center of Ferguson? What's at stake? What are the demands of protesters? So it's got chemistry, biology, history, political science and sociology, art, computer science, English literature, psychology, women's studies, and specific questions. So in other words, making them approach something they were all hearing about from very different points of view and constructing one large, more complex understanding of this than just what they're hearing from a journalist. So arguably, you could look at the syllabus and find some other spaces to do this in very direct, explicit way. And so I'm going to leave that up there. And now hear what you came up with in your small groups. We didn't do introductions, Asia, because you weren't here yet, so we'll do that right when you go to your thing. I needed one to But can we hear some of what you came up with in your small groups in terms of moments of interdisciplinarity? Maybe I won't leave this up here. I'll go back to the questions.
So
Let's hear it.
we had multiple disciplines within our circle, some from one person. I'm just messing. So scientific, we had someone who is in biology, English, history, gender, women's studies, Africana studies, diasporic studies, Africana women's studies, sociology, and psychology. So from that, we found how we were having a thorough conversation about how biology can be used as a big part of having this discussion. I did not catch your name. Elisa. Wait. Elisa. Thank you. Okay.
Introduction. All right, I'll let you finish and then maybe we'll do the introduction.
Right.
Go ahead.
So, what Miss Elisa was telling us is that, in her lab, how she discusses these different cells and how they live in certain areas, how things have been extracted from the British and used in their own way. So that kind of aligns a lot with like colonization, and we look at it mainly from like of course, a cultural perspective, maybe a gender perspective, but looking in terms of how physiologically Black bodies are used for the scientific advancements of others, that sort of thing. So that was fun. It was really interesting to hear, because that's something we don't hear too often in terms of how does science and biology and the physiological makeup of somebody actually impact how they're marginalized and the ways in which they're marginalized. Also, looking into storytelling, back up. So birth. Within the African diaspora, this notion of transitioning, notion of mothering within the diaspora, so English being used in terms of storytelling. Prime example, the first week with Freire, using how did Freire come to his conclusion, how did he come to this particular theory. And I put, of course, in here how storytelling is constructed in gender, because particularly going into Beverly Guy Sheftall's gender as an analytic category, how do we kind of tell the story about how we came to understand our gender? And that kind of helps them, because essentially the first week we are giving them the lens, taking off the lens of what they're used to looking at, the diaspora, world history, Black people themselves, taking off that lens and putting on different lenses. So whether it be English, whether it be gender studies, whether it be science or whatever, finding different lenses in order to kind of really having a consciousness to kind of reach their consciousness before we even get to the diaspora. So we were talking a lot about that, how that gives them a foundation so they can look at the diaspora from many different lenses.
Yeah. I didn't use the word lens before, but that's very useful, obviously, for both of our terms of engagement today. Different disciplinary lens, geographic lens, etc. Thanks for reminding us of the lens part. One small word, but so helpful. So
we talked about a bunch of other things, but those are what I wrote down.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so now that we're all here, let's do the introduction thing. So if we could just go around your name and your discipline or your degree, however you want to put it. If you want to start, just go all the way around.
Hi, my name is Jamie Canty. I just completed my doctorate. Yay! Woo woo! Yes, just completed like last semester. Glory to God. And it's in humanities and with a concentration in Africana women's studies and political science. So it is kind of interdisciplinary, but I focus more on the humanistic component to gender and women's studies as it manifests in the diaspora.
Shekinah Haley. I'm just gonna say, so Africana studies based in psychology, sociology, and I have a literary background too, but that's like so far along the way. And using the diaspora perspective and all of that. I'm just interdisciplinary in nature, so I can't, it's hard to like separate out into one thing. So that's all I'm gonna say.
That's all your degrees.
Gender. I'm just,
My name is Elisa Griffin. I am a molecular cell biologist by training, and I spent many years in cancer research.
Hi, Brittany Riggins. By training, I'm in English, 20th century United States.
I'm Prashpa Parekh in the English department, but I teach post-colonial literature, which is interdisciplinary in college.
I'm Michelle Hay. I'm an anthropologist, interdisciplinary, cross-cultural.
I'm Brittany Scott, economics by training, development economics.
Kwame Osasco Kalimara, law and theology, by experience, work with treatment communities, and I'm an activist, still continuing.
Peru Black psychology is my discipline, and African-centered psychology in particular. Also a visual artist and a traditional African percussionist, so they have their own little interdisciplinary activities.
I'm sorry, I'm looking back this way. Good morning, my name is Roberto Gibraltaric, and I'm in the Department of World Languages. My discipline is Hispanic Civilization and Culture, and my doctorate is in Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership.
Although I'm not a faculty, I have a background in public and community health, and a general interest in social and economic development.
I wanted to introduce Natasha Emanuel, who is our new staff member for the First in the World project, and she'll be responsible for the peer recitation facilitators. As you know, beginning in fall of 2018, we will start the second phase of the project, and she will be responsible for making sure that the tutors you select this semester, and you will receive a letter next week asking you to select students who may qualify. We're using the term peer recitation facilitator because the students will not have the traditional peer tutoring role. They will not work one-on-one, they'll be working with small groups, and they'll be facilitating small group discussions to help reinforce concepts that have been taught in the classrooms. So, this is Natasha.
Thank you.
Alex Pierre, I'm in the language department in ADW. My background is in Francophone studies, but also post-colonial studies.
Okay, I'm Fran Jackson, I think you all know me, and my background is in teacher education.
I'm Inez Diaz. I teach Portuguese at the World Languages. I have a literature background. I do film, and I work also transnationally with Portuguese-speaking African countries, Latin America, Europe.
Hello, my name is Sakina Davis. By training, I'm a classical vocalist, and my degree, I had a concentration in ethnomusicology.
So Alika Williams Livingston, my PhD is in Africana Studies, also MPH and MBA, and my research focus is traditional medicine and traditional healing, including herbs and plants. Almost, I was a history major here at Spelman, so I got a lot of interdisciplinary things going on there.
Hi, I'm Hanan Davis. I'm in the music department, and my specialty is performance, vocal performance.
My name is Tiffany Oliver. I'm in the biology department, and I'm trained as a geneticist.
I'm Joan Cardi. I'm in the Department of Theater and Performance, and my concentration is in actually management, but I also have a creative writing track.
Hello everyone, my name is Almost Day Richardson. I am also very interdisciplinary. I have a degree in drama. I have a degree in counseling psychology and educational psychology. And the work that I do is with traditional African spirituality, multicultural education, diversity, and culturally responsive pedagogy.
So I am not ADW faculty. OPI, the First Annual Grant. My name is Jamaica Bailey Wright, and my background is in cognitive psychology.
Hello, Mason Kim. I'm political science PhD, and currently I'm in the International Studies department. I'm teaching world politics and international development.
My name is Jacqueline Alvarez. I teach world language and literature. My area of study is colonial Hispanic American literature with a focus in Afro-Indian population in the colonial period and earlier than that. And I think that all my training has been interdisciplinary too.
Okay, I'm Asia Leeds. My PhD is in African diaspora studies. I'm interdisciplinary, obviously. I use a lot of historical research methods, archival research. My work is on Blackness in Central America, in a nutshell.
I'm Sarah Bustecker, and my PhD is in anthropology. focus on Afro-Latin America, so very much consider myself an interdisciplinary African diaspora studies scholar. So obviously, we have a very multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary crowd here in this room. So, wow, that's really diverse. Far more diverse than the students who usually sit up. They're usually just 5 or so majors. This is much more diverse. So, okay, now we know who's here. So let's return to some of this conversation about moments and how you do it and that kind of stuff for, I don't know, 15 more minutes, and then I'm gonna let Asia take over for Global. If you wanna.
Yeah, and I think we have lunch coming, right, at some point?
So, whenever that shows up, we'll figure it out. All right, so let's chat.
I know in our group, we were talking about including, well, that we had an opportunity for more performance. In 112, week 6, we were talking about fire. And so some of the things we discussed concerning performance were having students write monologues, having them write poems, having them even create different paintings or things like that. During that week, being inspired by the words and drawing how they feel.
One student even created a beat. She created music that connected to how she felt when she was reading about all these things.
And this semester, I had my students do a cakewalk because we talked about the culture, and it was like, what is a cakewalk? It's like, we're about to find out now.
Okay,
So
Even had more cupcakes with it. So.
Nice touch, nice
touch. I just also want to add, in our group, we talked about 2 things that are kind of more general recommendations, but one to have an ADW week, maybe for both 111 and 112. So during that week, we'll be able to do more interdisciplinary things, right? Such as we were talking about during week, what is that? It's Sundiata, week 7 on the 111, like doing the dance and rhythms for Lamba. So, doing it in the classroom, but also having all the students, have a chance to be able to do those. So sometime during that ADW week, it would be more interdisciplinary things and hands-on activities, some fun stuff. And then the other one was ADW, maybe like monthly ADW field trips. They could be like, they only have to do 1 a year or something like that, but they can be low cost or free because we feel like there's so many things that they can be exposed to. For example, all of my students, and I hear everybody else saying the same thing, wanted to go see Black Panther together. And they were like, what's ADW doing? And I'm like, that's it. So they are kind of, we did talk about it in class, but they wanted to talk about like all of the ADW classes that are out there. So just trying to figure out how to incorporate, more field studies as well.
Each faculty here can initiate.
Oh, yes.
And
but they wanted something more formal.
Initiate a recommendation that comes from your class, just so you all know that you have the freedom to do that as well as what we need is budget to for field trips and all of that, but you can initiate definitely something like you think Black Panther movie watching together and discussing would be great. You can spread the word.
I had my students last year do I'm Not Your Negro. They went in their groups to do it, right? And then, but one group did, I encouraged them to go as a group if they wanted to, and one group did go as a group to see Black Panther.
As it pertains to week for ADW,
oh yeah.
Okay, the Transatlantic Moment, week 10 and 111. Just from a geneticist standpoint, a lip test. I don't know if you all have heard of it. So, in the moment between, when they had to choose which slaves were more likely to survive the transatlantic voyage, they would make them, they would wash them, you would wash them and make them run around, and then they would live their face, right? Because salt retention, if you retain more salt, you're going to retain more water. And so you'd be more likely to not dehydrate and survive this transatlantic voyage with limited resources. And so when you talk about now, downstream, the high incidence of heart disease, you know, potentially that LIC test serving as a genetic selecting mechanism. And when you interact, having a genetic predisposition for heart disease with, you know, environmental determinants from, you know, slavery that, you know, we kind of get our soul food from and things like that, that some of which may not be so healthy, may impact the download.
Do you have a reference for where I can read about that? Because, you know, I'd heard about it and I was like, I think Oprah, some of my students told me about Oprah having a show about it, and I was like, I don't believe that stuff. But because I really didn't, I really haven't read about it. Do you have a reference for it?
I can.
A solid one?
Yeah.
Okay.
They have like pictures, like, you know, that they depictions and things like that.
So two things came to mind from what your group was just describing. What you just mentioned, the LIC test, so we're getting into the more physical. I was thinking the week that we talk about race, week 4 in fall semester, and it's all about, partially about the social construction of race, as the socio-historical concept. Okay, good, got it. So the opposite of that is that people used to think it was biological, so I'll insert, I'm a cultural anthropologist, you know, I'll insert some physical anthropology and I'll talk a little bit about human evolution and natural selection and why that's not about race, it's about something else. So that's one way of introducing something interdisciplinary. And then also when you're talking about making them perform and, you know, create something during week 7 of this semester, when they're, you know, they know something about the Harlem Renaissance, they're talking about negritude and negrismo. Something I've done, it didn't happen this semester, but it happened last spring, is break them into 3 groups and give each group, you know, you write a poem about negritude, or as if you were someone from negritude, negrismo, or the U.S. Harlem Renaissance, and they don't know which group has which. And they're not supposed to be really overt about it, but they have some ideas about the themes that these people in the different movements were concerned with, and their different perceptions of race mixing and negrismo and negritude, about, you know, its African essence, and yeah, we all know the difference. So, but they have to convey that in a poem that they write as a group, and then they have to guess each other, which movement are they representing and how do they know. So, you know, because they've gotten a lecture and they know straightforward, but now how do you express that creatively? It's in the same spirit as the performance projects in the fall, right? So that was another example.
We also talked about dance and capoeira and slave spirituals.
Week 13, I think. Concerning the race of either.
Yeah. How capoeira is was a means of resistance. How they trained to fight. So we did, and the Negro spirituals, the forms of communication.
Right. I explained the 3 different types of spirituals. We have the work songs, the cold songs, and the jubilees. And I haven't seen the cold songs, you know, in class. This is what you're talking about, wading in the water. What does it mean? We're literally talking about you wading in the water. Why do you wade in the water? We'll go through that. And then on Saturday, talked about how hair, like hair braiding had cold, like the colds had were inside of the cornrows. So.
And we also, last thing, talked about week 16 of 111 with scientific racism. Enlightening. How, you know, there are pills you can take now. You don't have to use like these creams for lightning. And, you know, I talked about, in my class, talk about Shonda Rhimes, who has admitted to lightning, and, you know, Nene Leakes and other people. And just their perception on skin color. You know, when she was talking about it, she described skin color as something like hair or clothes, right? That you can just change, like it's, you know, so, you know, just how different perceptions. And from a biological standpoint, how those types of drugs and things work.
Yeah, lest they think that week 16,
Oh, yes,
that it
talk about
only
Shahida.
happened, that it only happened in Latin America at the point when these, lest they be left with that impression. Yeah, I can see you're bringing it into, right.
And we talk about Trujillo from a biological perspective in the Dominican Republic, who would, he made, amongst the other things that were very terrible that he did, he made the Dominican an asylum for other people from other countries, because he wanted to physically whiten them. So Asian people, people of lighter hues from other places, he welcomed them to the Dominican Republic so that they could, you know, integrate into society and physically have offspring that were lighter.
My group talked about a number of things, and I guess I'll start with what I talked about, and that is, since I'm in theater and performance, sometimes I encourage the use, because I have, after the first day, the second day, students have to perform, or whether it's in a oral report, but I try to go to something more creative, and I push that they could create, and they have done some very interesting short, because I've got some aspiring filmmakers in our group, and we have people in different disciplines. So and this is what the group talked about, assigning students to take upon issues and look at it from their own discipline, their own major, as we spoke about. And then you get all the interdisciplinarity and kinds of things. We also talked about using the week that we deal with fire to contextualize your own major and create and write different pieces and create new materials. And that has worked well for some of the folks in the group. Also, I do something that's called, I have to call it controlled storytelling, so that I ask students when they read something to come back the next day, the next time we meet, and give some examples as to how this reading relates to your own life. And I call it control because I don't want it a rap session. I want it to be particular and specific to a point that was made in the actual reading. So that the idea of storytelling all the way back from when we read Sundiata is encouraged through the, in the context of the class, but not just rap, but it has to relate to a specific point or issue that we're covering. In terms of interdisciplinarity, we also said that when we are in the week that we are reading about fire and degree smoke, often I have someone in the class who is a Spanish major or has taken enough Spanish even in high school to actually perform or read the poetry in the native language. I think it's important for students to hear things as they come out of the mouth of the writer, because we're reading the translation. But and then they always have something to add because they have that knowledge about, well, this word can also mean such, and then it opens up discussion. Even this week, we were reading about Claudia Jones, and someone had in English, an English major had done a research paper on her in the previous semester, so she had all kinds of other information that she shared. So, you know, trying to do these kinds of things and to keep, but we also said there are semesters, or not semesters, but readings that are more difficult, because I'm in performance. You know, I love the Harlem Renaissance. I love all of the things in that week that we're doing that and looking at that literature. But others, Mason might be more comfortable when, because of his background, looking at things that deal with economics and history, and that's strength. So we were wondering if there are ways, and then Jacqueline has such the background in colonialism and literature. Is there a way that we could, and maybe I'm hearing that in the other groups, come together and maybe do some kinds of workshops that we could share techniques, so that the ideas we're sharing now could maybe even be led by one of us, you know, as
And we
a
can
visitor
flesh
in
it
the
out
class.
more, because as it's becoming evident, there is not enough time to elaborate. These are all great ideas, and I'm going to send you all an email afterwards to actually get your lists compiled. So at this point, do we need to shift gears? It's 11:40 and we still have a whole other term of engagement to address and some kind of lunch at some point somewhere. I don't know.
Lunch is here now.
It is. Oh, okay.
So should we break?
I'm satisfied. Thank you for your input on interdisciplinarity.
So I think maybe we should give like a 10-minute break to grab lunch, but then have a working lunch with our next set of questions. That's good, everyone? Put a break to go to the bathroom and everything. All right. So please let's come back in 10 minutes. Yeah, I know.
If you have a car, anybody needs to sign?
Diasporically connected to our text. So I'll do that. I'll bring in a little bit from week 6 and 7, and also week 12, which on the surface is a very U.S.-centered conversation. So I'll talk about how I put the text into a global and diaspora context. So first, and I'm glad that Sarah opened us up with a conversation about interdisciplinarity. These things are difficult to teach, right? It's difficult to teach interdisciplinarily, and it's difficult to teach about the African diaspora, right? This is a complex site of investigation. We think about diasporas in plural, multiple, overlapping, the way they interact with other diasporas, right? So there's a lot going on here. This is a complex space of investigation. So I wanted us to think about the following questions to open us up as a larger group. What are some examples of diaspora teaching? This could be lectures, activities, assignments, or other things in your ADW class that you're particularly proud of. What are some challenges to teaching diaspora and diasporically? Which weeks in ADW 1112, I want to focus on 1112 in this conversation, pose the greatest challenge to you, right, based on your own disciplinary background or etc. So which ADW weeks in 1112 pose the greatest challenge to teaching diasporically? And then lastly, what impact do you think learning about the African diaspora has on your students? So what has been sparked through this diaspora engagement and diaspora lens? So I'll open it up to the group, to the floor. What are some examples of diaspora teaching in your ADW class that you're particularly proud of? Does anyone have any activities or assignments that they have created that they want to share with the group? Yeah.
Well, when we, the week which is coming up, that we deal with the Black Panther Party, we look at the 10-point program and platform, and much like I heard in FIRE, my students create their own contemporary 10-point program and platform, either from a community aspect, a 10-point program and platform that should be implemented at Spelman College, and then they, talk about activism. What would they do? What are they planning to do to implement those things? And then students talk and share about each other's work. Because I like to teach that as a living thing. And then because, I have a background as a member of the Illinois chapter, it's very important to me to make the ideas of the platform a living thing, contemporary. What, not a trip down memory lane to the glory of the Black Panther Party, but today, what do you bring?
And also, in terms of how that intersects with diaspora, though, if you go through point by point of the original or what they come up with, how applicable is it to other national contexts? And how much has it has impacted, organizing in other countries, but not everywhere, and why not? So that's another way of entering into it diasporically.
Others? We can really jump in with any question, but I think it would be great to start. And what are some of those places or activities that you feel like you're most proud of, or you see success in teaching transnationally, diasporically, globally?
If I could just add, and then I talk a little bit about the global chapter of the international chapter of the Black Panther Party too. How we have people all over the world, embassies and such.
I'd like to present an experience, if I can call it an experience. My general approach to ADW has been around constructive conversation. I always feel like, and I'm always amazed at the creative things that people have suggested as ways to generate activity and dialogue. I don't know that I'm that person. I don't seem to. But anyway, I try to figure out things that I can figure out and try to borrow ideas. One idea that I don't know if I got it from somebody or not, but I've used the logs, and I've printed out logs of everybody in the class, and I'll, cut off names or whatever. And I'll pass the logs out randomly and ask persons to read the logs and then kind of critique. What did the person say, in your opinion? And then what are your ideas based on commentary to that log? I've also regenerated those logs, like the printout of the log, after having discussion about a particular topic. In your new reflection of your old reflection, what would you add on to your log that's different than the log that you submitted? So those are kind of things, just real small activities. Again, like I said, I don't know that I necessarily have the kind of success that I would like. I feel like I got the class with all the quiet ones, but I got people who seem to carry the class a lot. And then but I just try to work with my resources. And so that's just an activity that has had some degree of success, and I felt satisfied by the nature of those.
We may also think of things that we bring in, like music, right? You talked about dance and sound that might help you teach diasporically. I don't know if there are any examples anyone wants to share, that dance or video clips, anything like that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Alex.
No, when I don't remember the week, but anyway, yeah, the one on diaspora as process that is constantly being made. I use Wika, one of her videos, where she talks about the diaspora, the fact that she's not from here, but she's still from here, and so just a few seconds, and then what we do also is we get a map, and so we play we basically discuss her background using the map, Africa and Europe and Spain specifically. So it's both visual and
right.
Out of it, and the students respond well to that. Yeah. It really gets them to think also in terms of, and it's always an opportunity because we have more and more Latinas or Latinx, I guess. So that's an opportunity for them, those who want, to share, their own experience, what it's like.
Connected to that, in 111, I've created an assignment where my students write their own diaspora story after they read Hippolyte. And what I discovered is that we oftentimes assume that our populations are much more African American than they are, or US based. So I find that there's a great representation of the West Indies, Latin America, and West Africa in my classes if you ask. And even if it's not themselves personally, they may have a parent or a grandparent who has a diaspora journey. So that helps me to also globalize our conversations because I remind us that we are, in fact, a global community within our class space. Were there others? Sorry, Sakina, I'll get back.
I just want to respond to some of that because more students this semester are talking about some of their backgrounds. There were a few who mentioned things last semester, but I'm definitely hearing more about Afro-Latina students coming out this semester, or my father's Dominican, or my family's Dominican, my family's Cuban, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And one of the activities that I did for the New Negro movement, I kind of modeled a way to look at something in specific and fire, and then extract, certain themes of identity or like movement. So I focused on music and socioeconomic class, and then I was like, you do the same thing, and they taught their in group. They did presented on the next class, and some really good discussions came out of that. A lot of course
gonna close the door.
having to do with like popular culture, and of course a lot of people really respond to color struggle and colorism. And then we talked about also like the idea of the reappropriation or the destigmatization of the word negra. During negritude, and then one of the students brought up that's how they feel that the word nigger has been reappropriated, and then that was a whole big discussion on who gets to say it, and there was a disagreement about, well, if you're Afro-Latina, but you don't identify, and so we had all this whole debate going on in class, if you're from the islands, and from here or here. So I thought that was a really interesting exchange.
Yeah, and in pop culture, I think Afro-Latinidad is showing up a lot more. So in Love and Hip Hop Miami, and we're talking about Amara La Negra. So we can make connections to pop cultural things that they're already taking in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and within that, there's Amara La Negra, and then I can't remember the other one that has blonde hair. And someone actually came to the one with the blonde hair and talked to her because she was using the N-word in her songs. So that was even a conversation that we're able to use.
Yeah.
That's great.
We're using Love and Hip Hop Miami as a text in my Black Women in Latin America class because there's so much that comes up.
There is, there's so many connections.
Yeah. Did I see someone send on the side?
Yeah, I
paper?
was just saying that during the enslavement portion, I used something like the first 20 minutes or something like that of the Book of Negroes, the first portion. It's like no other miniseries, whatever I've ever seen since apparently there's so many slave stories that are out there, but it talks about the transport from in the internal part of Africa to the coast and what that was. And it shows it through the eyes of a little girl, which Gomez talks about. Very often children were captured, all of that in this way that I think comes across very well to them in terms of the Middle Passage, all that other kind of stuff to really allow that to hit home in a way that I think just reading it.
Right.
Yeah. I introduced Catherine Dunham.
My favorite.
I think on March 1st, as a matter of fact, it was like, oh, we just left Black History Month, so welcome to Women's Year. And because it's a nice marriage of scholarship and performance, and talk about the different places that she went, Jamaica, and she stayed, I think, in a Komodo community in Jamaica. And I was like, remember last semester? And you're like, oh yeah, that's what this is. So that was nice. I didn't get to the activity that I went to because we were talking, but they were engaged and they were talking about those things. And at some point, I can't remember when I did it, but I had to write a letter to their ancestors.
Oh, cool.
And I was like, you can ask questions or you can not ask questions. It can be a happy letter, it can be a sad letter, it can be an angry letter. But if you have the opportunity to talk to your family members who have passed on, what would you say? And the letter was nice.
That's amazing.
So yeah, it was nice to see them express some of these emotions that not all of them express openly in class.
Yeah, I think that's amazing because when I do my diaspora story assignment, I notice that people who have sort of roots from descendants of enslaved people in the U.S. often reflect on this sort of, space of question, right? Like that there's this, almost a sadness in not being able to have a particular location. But that's a part of diaspora as well. It's like contending with this disparate dispersal, right? So that's part of the story too. But I really like that idea of writing a letter to ancestors. And in terms of Catherine Dunham and also Zora Neale Hurston, I mean, they're both really great to not only use as scholars who travel and do field work and are pioneers in their fields and are anthropologists, but they also initiate African diaspora studies as a field of study and rigorous scholarly engagement. So I love using both of them as examples of African diaspora scholarship in action. So maybe we can move on to talk about what some of the challenges are, where we see spots in the syllabus where it's more challenging to be diaspora-based or teach diasporically. Are there weeks in ADW 1112 where you struggle to make the conversation transnational and diasporic? Can you just take a look at 1112 and see if any of the weeks stand out to you as weeks where you struggle to kind of make these transnational linkages? Yeah.
We already talked about this, but well, in our group, but you already heard this, but I'll just share it with the group. One of the challenges that I have is the class struggle with Nkrumah.
Yes.
While I do have a poli-sci lens a little bit, I can use it. It's just sometimes I stick just to that. And part of talking about neocolonialism and things of that sort, capitalism, Marxism, and that sort of thing, what socialism is and what it means, because a lot of them don't understand those concepts. So I find myself kind of having to go back a little bit and just give them some foundational stuff before we even get to Nkrumah. So sometimes it's hard for me to finish Nkrumah because I have to go through, okay, what's capitalism, what's Marxism, how is it different from communism, and all this other good stuff. How is capitalism linked to how Americans think of democracy and things of that sort. So it's just, that's my marker.
Yeah. I find that focusing on bios really helps me keep every conversation a little bit diasporic. Bios and also linkages, friendships, camaraderies across transnational spaces. So within Nkrumah, I'll obviously talk about, how he's trained at an HBCU.
Right. And then,
how he, at Lincoln University, how he's meeting up in London with a variety of people who will go on to be also first presidents of independent nations, etc. So I think bios for me help ground, and friendships help me to make those linkages, even when we're maybe talking about one text.
Yeah, because I do have pictures of Nkrumah with Du Bois and Martin Luther King and such, so to kind of make that global but it stops there. No.
Yeah, I'm trying. Any other weeks? And I can go through my teaching demo shortly, and if you think of something as I'm going through, feel free to stop me as well. Any other weeks where you struggle? Now I'm gonna do a teaching demo on week 12, as I mentioned, which at the surface looks like a very sort of African American US focus, right? But I'm going to show that it's pretty easy to put all of these texts in the conversations, using bio, using camaraderie and linkages and organizations. I guess lastly we can talk briefly about the impact you think that learning about the African diaspora has on our students. Thinking globally, utilizing a transnational lens. How does the impact show up in the
I
students?
have a lot of students that say when they're taking ADW, the impact isn't as significant as after their W2. And they go on to sophomore year, year, and then the importance shows up.
Or when they go home
I'm
for
hearing
break.
students say they don't appreciate it as much.
Right.
While they're
when
taking it. I think we all rebel against things that are required.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I think that they start to, my students say they kind of understand themselves and where they fit in the world, not just where they fit in the United States. Particularly when we go into antiquity and things of that sort, and negritude and negrismo and all that. I think they start to see themselves not only in the context of the United States, but also throughout the world. A lot of my students will go home for break and be like, they see family members and they're like, Canty, let me tell you about what my grandma said that was so off the wall, it was so out of pocket, what they say. So it's just that kind of, I think it helps them understand their own identities outside of just the United States. So,
Others?
Yeah, please. Okay, I was just thinking about, because I was all Black Panther, Wakanda signs in my class. And there was no, and I was talking about you need to go see it and all these things, and talking about linkages between that and coming to America as far as
like depictions of these made up kingdoms.
Yeah.
And like Come to America came out like legit 30 years ago.
Right.
So I thought that was interesting. But there was one student who doesn't really speak very much, and she was speaking so passionately about what Black Panther represented as far as her identity. And you know, I like to think that ADW has something to do with that. But she was really just talking about what it means and what it means for younger generations and for children who didn't have what she, or who have more than what she had. And I think that that's kind of what ADW was for a lot of people. Having the Michael Gomez text as a textbook. And we talked about like, what would that be like if that was your textbook in history? And people were just like, oh, and you know, my entire life would have been different. The way that race relations were in my community would have changed. And so I think that it really helps them to picture different possibilities.
Especially with Black Panther.
And I think thinking and reading and writing with the transnational framework is a skill that you leave with that can be applied to various disciplinary, inquiry, and also you know, their careers. So I think if we can emphasize that you leave ADW with a certain set of skills, right, that this framework and lens actually results in you thinking in new ways, I think that this is an important thing to emphasize. Were you going to add something? Yeah, you did.
No, I was just going to say that sometimes when you teach and you have a class that has first-year students and you have your fourth-year students, and sometimes your first-year students may say something, and I'm happy to report that it's not done from a place of meanness. But sometimes the seniors or juniors will say, well, you know, you're going to get to ADW at a point and you're going to see that this concept, and you might then revisit what you just said, and you know, and then the other women in the class would be nodding, yes, you know. So I see them retaining certain concepts and the gaze as they look at complex problems.
Sure.
And that's good.
Yeah, I mean, that's our goal. So let me get into a little bit of what I have here. And I'm just going to show you some slides from my own lectures that I give. So I break up the week. Tuesday and Thursday I teach. Tuesdays I lecture on the material. And I want to say something about when I lecture, I'm not providing summaries on these readings. They can read, right? I'm providing the context, the framework, adding things to make sense of the text, pulling out key concepts, but I'm in no way giving them a summary, right? They're capable. So I'm going to just show a couple of slides where I give the historical context for a conversation and put it in a transnational or diaspora framework. So this graph here would be from week 6. Now in week 6, we talk about the New Negro movement. Well, it's part 1 of 2, in which we're having conversations around basically Black arts movements, right? Negritude, Negrismo, and the New Negro movement. On week 6, we start with the New Negro movement. So that's where we have efflorescence and fire, the week that a lot of students are excited. So I don't just focus there on Harlem or what's called the Harlem Renaissance that week. I'm putting movements and migrations into a global context so that students are ready then for the conversation around Negrismo and Negritude the following week. So this says Black travel and migration in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, I'm piggybacking off of Gomez's, right? What does he say? Reconfigurations, reconnections. I'm talking about how movement, for various reasons, kind of sparks these Pan-African connections. So I'll talk about labor migration and urbanization, right? We see Black folks moving across the world. And we can even think about the Great Migration as a diaspora, right? People who are dispersed from the South into the Midwest and the North, right? The urban North. This is also a part of the patterns of urbanization that we see not only in the US, but also in places like Latin America, right? In Brazil, although of course we know that there was slavery in cities, we at around this time, right, turn of the century to early 20th century, see the movement of people who are coming out of northeastern Brazil and more rural backgrounds moving into cities in Rio and Sao Paulo, so there's urbanization there. We also have a large number of West Indians, right, who are in Harlem. So the Harlem Renaissance is never just a sort of African-American space of production, that it already is a global thing, because Harlem itself is this global site. And so in my conversations, in my lectures, I like to point at these points of global connection and linkages, right? So cities, right? Places like Harlem and London and Paris. But also, and then I'll talk about this more, organizations and how we can see friendships form across national boundaries. So I want to make sure that students aren't leaving week 6 only talking about Harlem and only talking about African Americans, because West Indians are also in Harlem. Africans are also in Harlem, right? And people are talking to each other. And in addition, a number of I'll talk about this in a second, the New Negro movement artists are traveling a lot themselves, right? The second point where I see how we can map sort of diaspora movement this time is military experience. So there are Black Americans we know, but also African soldiers who are enlisted to fight on behalf of their colonial, the colonial empires in World War I and World War II. So we see this movement via military service that is also sparking certain ideas, right? You're asking questions of your nation, right? If you're fighting to protect it and then coming back to Jim Crow USA, right? This is their questions for citizenship that you will ask. So sometimes, and I like to say this about my own travels, stepping outside of the US makes things clearer for me to see, makes relationships of power clearer for me to see from afar. And then of course the migrations of students and artists, right? Almost everyone whose texts that we read and whose theories that we use in our class has some sort of international journey, right? So if we engage those bios, I think it's a great way to bring in the diaspora, even if at the surface there's a week that looks very US centered. So again, people like Nkrumah who are trained at Lincoln University, right? We see African and Caribbean students at HBCUs. That's important too for us to get HBCUs in the mix, because that comes back around at the end of the semester. We're talking about the civil rights and Black power movements. We want to center that these are student-led. Black Americans and students in London and Paris, so we see important connections happening in these sort of metropoles, and we see them happening elsewhere too, but there's something about these metropoles that lend themselves to these kind of diaspora and Pan-African organizations and productions, right? So I highlight the connections, the points of meeting, right, these intersections. So that's how I would have, I obviously say a lot more about all of these, but that's how I frame the historical context for week 6, which is the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. For week 7, I love Venn diagrams. It helps me to organize a lot of different information in a meaningful way. So for when we come to week 7 then, what we're tasked with is putting what we've done in week 6, which is the New Negro movement, Harlem Renaissance, into conversation with negritude, negrismo, and the Black experimental theater in Brazil. That's a lot to do. What I love about the Davis and Williams piece, Pan-Africanism, Negritude, and the Currency of Blackness, is that it's one of few texts that we have which employs directly a diaspora framework, right? They're doing the work of bringing in what's happening in different sites, putting them into conversation, and showing points of distinction. So it's a good week for me to utilize a Venn diagram. Sometimes I have students do Venn diagrams, so they can fill out where things intersect and where they're distinct. So if I'm putting together, so I have 4 circles here representing the 4 different sort of artistic movements, right? And I always go to the center first. What is at stake here, right? And this is shared experience of second-class citizenship, being denied citizenship, and dehumanization. And I always ask students, there's much more that we can say, and they always, at this point, will add on, right? How we can connect these 4 different kinds of movements is that art is key to redefining what it means to be Black. We can't separate the sort of artistic and the political. We see pride and self-affirmation and the centrality around self-representation tied into these Black art movements. the quest for equality and full citizenship, although it looks different in different places, we see Black people, right, at the margins of belonging. And this rejection of the idea of Black inferiority. So these are some ways in which I see all of these movements intersecting. I, of course, start with the New Negro movement because we've already had that in week 6, right? So I just remind students that about these global linkages that are already happening in Harlem. I remind them of the New Negro movement as being this one of direct fearlessness, right? That young people are asserting themselves in ways different from an older generation. And I also highlight here that the New Negro movement is very interdisciplinary. It's not just a literary movement, but in fact we see a flourishing of Black cultural production in a lot of different ways. And I love this image from Harlem. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is it might be a UNIA parade, but I love that this placard says that the New Negro has no fear. So this captures for me what the New Negro movement is about. If I move on to negritude then, right, what I do is bring in a couple people. You all know what negritude is, so you don't need to read my notes here, but what I do is then bring in how the New Negro movement and negritude are connected. And I do it in a couple ways. One, Langston Hughes really pops up everywhere, which I love. Right here he is talking to Leon Damas, who we know is considered one of the so-called fathers of negritude. And Paulette Nadal, this is a great way to bring her in, who is a Martinican student in Paris who does the work of translating a lot of the Harlem Renaissance literature, right? That without her translating, right, Senghor and Damas and Césaire might not have had access to these texts and literature that would also inspire them. So here we can bring in negritude women to make the connection, right? How do we map the overlap between negritude and the New Negro movement? When I'm connecting negrismo and the Black experimental theater, I want to remind us of what we've learned about Cuba and Brazil, right? These are two significant places in Latin America in that they were the last two places to abolish slavery, right? 1886 and 1888. So I'm having students think about what's at stake here with people who are just recently out of slavery in a lot of ways. So I also remind them of whitening, right? We had that concept in 111, which should carry on to thinking about what's at stake in negrismo and what's at stake in the Black experimental theater, and on and on and on. I also want to remind my students that in Latin America, we see the development of Black political parties, or we don't in the United States, right? One is the Partido Independiente de Color in Cuba, the other, the Frente Negra Brasilera in Brazil. Very different, but reminding them that we have this Black history of Black political parties in Latin America. And of course, violence and suppression wherever we see Black solidarity. So in Negrismo, I talk about why it is that Guillen and others are adopting a more patriotic version of this Black arts movement. It's because they're just coming off of a 1912 massacre of thousands and thousands of Afro-Cubans who are organizing under this Partido Independiente de Color. So this is a time period where you're treading lightly around the ways that you talk about race and Blackness. So we see this emphasis on unity, this patriotic, cautious kind of arts. I also bring Langston Hughes back again because he's everywhere. He's friends with Guillen. They're talking and corresponding, and the great thing about Langston Hughes is that he also speaks Spanish. So he's able to read Guillen's poetry in Spanish and give him feedback. So they have a lot of conversations with each other. And I got an example of some of their letters, a little segment, a couple lines from one of their letters to each other, right? And Hughes writes Guillen, he says, "Man, your motivos de son are stupendous. They're at once very Cuban and very good. I like them all." He says, "And be careful not to write new motivos too hastily. Give them time to grow inside your heart. And poems are not written because the public wants them, but because the poet is ready to sing." So Guillen and Hughes are doing this sort of giving each other feedback and facilitating this kind of, diaspora relationship. These are the kinds of things I highlight when I'm teaching. I don't know who these guys in the middle are. I just don't give them any shine. But we see. Okay, great. It's a whole bunch of literary giants then. But we see Hughes and Guillen on the outside of the group.
That was in 36, wasn't it?
Okay, thank
back
you.
in the Civil
Yeah, it's
War.
somewhere.
In Spain.
Okay, that's a very interesting part. I'm sure I have that in my notes somewhere, but thank you for that. And then, of course, I go into the Teatro Experimental do Negro and talk about the particulars of that and bring in some images, which I think are really powerful, right? And how sort of staging Blackness is a part of this kind of remaking, redefining what it means to be Black. I love that the piece, Davis and Williams, has us thinking about how negritude as an idea is appropriated in a Brazilian context. So we have to talk about this issue of translation. If you've read Brent Hayes Edwards' The Practice of Diaspora, he emphasizes translation as this the way in which diaspora is enacted, right? So diaspora is this thing that is moving and being translated and re-articulated, and it's something that's not still. And translation, right, translating whether it's linguistic or translating an idea to your own historical and political context, is very much a part of what's happening here. So that was my Venn diagram. So the last example I'll give, I think I'm doing okay on time, is from week 12, which is Liberation Movements and Anti-Colonial Struggles, the first conversation, part 1 of 2. And there you'll notice that the students read Michael Gomez Movement People. They read Carmichael and Hamilton's Black Power, Its Need and Substance. And they read Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. So someone had already mentioned how they put King in conversation with Nkrumah. Yep. And I do. First I start off the whole entire semester like that because it's King's birthday when we first start. But I bring in these global connections, right? That it's significant that in 1957, Dr. King and Coretta traveled to West Africa, traveled to Ghana to be present at the ceremony for the newly independent nation of Ghana. They're there to see the Union Jack lowered and the Ghanaian flag raised. And I think that's a powerful thing to think about, right? He's off the heels of a successful Montgomery bus boycott. So think about how the success of African independence movements at this time to create independent nations inspires the civil rights movement. I think oftentimes in our very US-centric ways of thinking about Black history, we think that it's Black Americans who are inspiring the rest of the world, when in fact, this goes both ways. And I'll show you here that here's Dr. King and Nkrumah in 57. I use this map so much during the semester because I want people to notice, and I always zoom in, that Ghana at 57, right, gaining independence at 57, is going to be a leader in West Africa, right? It's going to inspire lots of people from the diaspora to just be present in Ghana and participate in the creation of this new nation, because Nkrumah is already an internationalist. He has already made his connections with people in London and people in the US, right? So he's building off of this to create this new nation state. And of course we see Dr. King and Coretta Scott King here taking pictures in Accra. Actually, I think they're in Cape Coast, right there. So he says in the letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King says, the nations of Africa and Asia are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. So we have evidence that, in fact, African independence is motivating and inspiring the civil rights movement. So this is a way that we can globalize and bring in diaspora into our teaching of something that looks very US-centered on the ground, at the base. We know that Nkrumah's Ghana has all kinds of characters in it, right? We see Du Bois on the right, who will be a close advisor, who will renounce his U.S. citizenship in '63 to become a Ghanaian citizen. And his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who is a Pan-Africanist in her own right, they're sitting around Nkrumah. We also see Malcolm X in Ghana, right? He spends time there and has important meetings with people. He's also getting to know thinkers in Accra. At the top left, we see him having a chat with Maya Angelou in Accra. And below, we see him talking to Shirley Graham Du Bois. This is after Du Bois has passed away. We know Du Bois passes away the day before the March on Washington, right? So for Malcolm X, he says, you can't understand what's going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what's going on in the Congo. I read this passage so many times in class, in 112. And you can't really be interested in what's going on in Mississippi if you're not also interested in what's going on in the Congo. They're both the same. The same interests are at stake. Not only in Mississippi and Alabama, he says, but right here in New York City, you and I can best learn how to get real freedom by studying how Kenyatta brought it to his people in Kenya. So we have two examples then in this passage from Malcolm X that that we have to connect imperialism abroad and Jim Crow at home, that they're fundamentally a part of the same system. And here you can go back to Gomez and thinking about how modernity and slavery and colonialism are all entangled, right? And Congo is important here because we know we've had a lot of Congo stuff this semester with King Leopold's Ghost, the film Lumumba, etc. So students are able to pick up on this, right? What's going on in the Mississippi freedom struggle and what's happening in Congo, right, post Lumumba's assassination. And so he shouts out Jomo Kenyatta, right, who's a friend of Nkrumah and others who are hanging out in London and creating these Pan-African organizations. So he's saying we need to look to these new nations in Africa to create the basis of Black freedom struggles in the United States. I also bring in Paul Robeson, who I think maybe we should have something about in this course because he's so phenomenal. Yes, Jones. Claudia Jones on his left, Amy Ashwood Garvey on his right. So I use this this quotation I discovered Africa in London to show how Black Americans, one, are getting hip to the news of what's happening in Africa while they're in these metropoles meeting other people, right? Robeson is friends with Jomo Kenyatta and others, right? So when he says I discover Africa in London, it's via these linkages and conversations. He's also studying in London in 1927. But he discovers Africa in London, and he's becoming a part of this sort of Pan-African struggle via his travels abroad. So we see Claudia Jones on the left, Amy Ashwood Garvey on the right, and you all know about Claudia Jones. We just had her this week, right? This Trinidadian-born woman whose own diaspora journey is quite impressive, right? So we know that she is born in Trinidad, raised in Harlem. She's deported and ends up in London, where she does the work of editing the West Indian Gazette and also creating the Notting Hill Carnival, right? So she has so many lives in a short life that I think it's important to note her diaspora journey. But I also would love it if somehow we find a piece about Amy Ashwood Garvey, who I'm obsessed with. And one day maybe I'll write about the friendship between Claudia and Amy. Amy Ashwood, born in, Garvey's first wife. I hate to say that, like always defining women by their partners, but a clear organizer in her own right, and someone who helped create the UNIA alongside Garvey. Remember, Amy Jakes comes afterwards, right? So she's born in Jamaica, but Amy Ashwood is raised in Panama. So this brings us back to this West Indian dispersal, which I talk about when I lecture on Garveyism, across Central America. These multinational corporations like United Fruit, the building of the Panama Canal,
all stimulates this West Indian movement. So Amy Ashwood herself has an interesting bio and diaspora journey that facilitates her Pan-Africanism, right? So she's born in Jamaica, raised in Panama, moves to New York to create the UNIA, and then goes on off to London in the 20s and 30s, where she's going to be one of those who help establish the International African Service Bureau, right? Alongside George Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta, C.L.R. James, etc. We notice how women often get left out of this conversation. So I try my best when I'm having these bios and linkages to highlight that women were at the table, were the creators and organizers of these organizations as well. And then just lastly, and I don't have much on this, but lastly, we talk about Black Power. There are a couple of things we have to recognize. Oh, first, before I move on, we also have to acknowledge Malcolm X's West Indian roots, too. Somehow that gets left out of the conversation, right? I think his mother's from Grenada. Yeah, so he grows up in a household of Garveyites and also with a West Indian mother. So we can make these connections into how his political philosophy connects him to, West Indian thinkers or global Black freedom struggles. If we talk about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, we also have to account for his bio, right? Trinidad born. And if we're talking about Black Power, we have to recognize that it has roots in sort of Lowndes County and in this deep South where SNCC is doing important organizing work on the ground, but that there was also a Black Power movement in Trinidad in 1970. So we can bring in the sort of Caribbean aspects of Black Power. It looked a little bit different there, obviously, but that we don't have to limit our discussion of Black Power within the U.S. nation state. And in fact, we have examples of how Black Power, the slogan, and as an organizing tool, shows up in different parts of the world, particularly because he is Trinidadian. We can focus on Trinidad there. And then I usually end this, my conversation on the bio of Carmichael with his marriage to Miriam Makeba. Right, singer, activist out of South Africa, who then, because the following week we're going to get into apartheid with Nelson Mandela. So this is a way to then, using bios and linkages, remind people of where we're headed next week, and also bring up a little bit about apartheid and how she's sort of exiled from her own nation because she's standing up to this really vicious and brutal regime. Okay, so that's what I have for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And are there any questions or comments? We have 10 minutes. Yeah.
Just to build on what you were just talking about, because one of the things I struggled with in my first year last spring was having enough time to really get into apartheid. And I wanted, also trying to bring in some of the movements with South African students that are happening now. Like this fall and but like, how do you balance that? Because I just feel like with all the heavy hitting readings we have, there's not enough time. And I think apartheid is extremely important, especially looking at how gentrification.
I do a lot of teaching of apartheid with visuals, and they get it very quickly, right? This spatial dimension of apartheid. You show the whites only beaches, etc. And then also with maps of land tenure. I do that for Zimbabwe. So what it looks like when the white minority rule takes over the land and how the majority of people have no access to it. So there are maps that actually show the movement from indigenous landowners to the white minority rule and what that looks like. So we can see that Black people, Black South Africans, Zimbabweans are removed from the best land. And I think this helps to visualize what apartheid is about. It's like this public separation, but it's also the seizure of the best land, right? So that's how I do it. And yeah, there's a lot to do every week, but we have 2 classes. So I find that while I pack a lot in, I feel satisfied with what I can do in 2 classes. And even if there's a student group that's facilitating on Thursday, I come in knowing what I want to hear. So if I don't, I'm going to bring those questions to the table. I let them go mostly, and they're usually actually very brilliant and amazing. So I just, can be a part of the conversation. But I know that there are points that I want to make sure that everyone gets before we leave that Thursday classroom, whether I'm facilitating it or not. And again, my goal as a lecturer and an expert in this field is not to simply give you a list of the main ideas, if you will, of the text. I'm pulling out key concepts, but what I bring to this table is having you think about this diasporically, right? And what this means in modeling a diaspora framework for students. I make sure that we know what the important concepts are and that they're pulled out, but I think sometimes people can feel even more burdened if you're putting that on yourself to get every point of every text to present it, and that's just not what I think I'm supposed to be doing, right? My role here is to facilitate a diaspora conversation and put things in historical and political context, which is my expertise. Okay, any others? Questions? We have a couple minutes, so anybody want to add anything about their own? Yeah.
I want to add that there's a video, I don't recall the name of it specifically or the author at this point, but it depicts the African Americans in the Civil War in Spain.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and then that's when they do talk about Nicolas Guillen and Ernest Hemingway and Hughes. The three of them went there to write. And also Robeson. He was singing to the troops, so that is something that even excerpts of that note would be able to be shown in the classroom. And they could see all of them in the same, doing the same epoch, same period, right there in Spain. And then coming back, as you're saying, back to the United States, and now there's Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And they're getting lynched every day just as they're singing over there fighting for freedom. No?
Right.
Against the Marxists and fascists. They come here, it's a different story.
Yeah.
I will give you the information. I will get
Please
to that.
do.
Yes, I will. I'll
Yeah.
give it to you later today.
That's great to bring in the Spanish War. And that also reminds me that Richard Wright wrote Pagan Spain.
Yes.
Yeah, from his time in at Spain during that time. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Any other additions, things that maybe my teaching demo has sparked in you that you can remember, some of the diaspora activities that you do that you'd like to share? Any other final points or questions?
There is an exhibit in the AUC library on student resistance within the AUC that's happening right now. And so I don't know if I'm going to actually take people over there or not, but I'm definitely going to recommend that they go. And it's been extended till May. And I think that there was a presentation that Alicia Day brought in last year with Mama Marimba, who was talking about SNCC and student involvement. She was a member of SNCC. Right, and so that's the focus, because a lot of students have asked, well, what can I do? What's wrong, how do I affect change? And so just again, highlighting student involvement in South Africa.
Definitely.
Here and in other locations.
Yeah, I'm going to send my students too. Maybe that should be like a writer's circle. Something. Yeah.
So wait, they extended it till May? They extended it till May?
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you.
I just want to make an announcement. I actually just sent a flyer next Thursday in the auditorium. I think at 6:30 p.m. they're doing a panel on rites of passage in the age of Wakanda. That should be interesting. We're going to let your students know about it. One of my sisters and I run a rites of passage here in Atlanta, and so one of our sisters was on the panel talking about rites of passage and from an African perspective, because a lot of what our students learn is coming from Ghana and Nigeria. So it will definitely be
You said you emailed it to, or?
No, they just said that's some other
Please, thank you.
All right, I can say I'm not going to be very good.